Ready? Okay, hi, this is BMS 345, and this is our Cerebrovascular lecture, so this is lecture 3. This is the outline for this lecture that I've written up here. I'm going to divide this lecture into 3 videos. So the first video, I'm going to talk about the importance of the cerebrovascular system. Then we're going to talk about the blood supply and go an overview of the blood-brain barrier, autoregulation, and anastomoses. So these will all be in video 1, or video A is what I'll be calling them on Canvas. And then the second video, video B, is going to be the internal carotid system. And then video C is going to be the vertebrovascular system. So that's our outline for the whole lecture and how I'm going to divide it into 3 different videos. So let's start with the importance of the cerebrovascular system. So if we move over here to our picture here, we've already learned a little bit about this, but we've learned that neurons need a lot of blood flow. So neurons can't store oxygen or glucose, and so they need a constant blood supply coming into the brain as well as the rest of the central nervous system for it to function properly. The cerebrovascular system is consisting of multiple different things. So it consists of arteries, capillaries, and veins, and those are all demonstrated on this picture here, which I really like. So what happened in this picture that's in your textbook is they injected a contrast material into the right carotid artery. And after about 2 seconds, you can see that dye moving through the arteries that supply the brain. And then after a few more seconds, you can see it going into the capillaries that go between the arteries and the veins. And finally, after, I can't remember, about 10 seconds or so, you can see it going into the venous system that drains the blood from the brain. So that is an overview of the cerebrovascular system. Another reason it's so important is because cerebrovascular accidents are one of the leading causes of neurological deficits. So CVAs, or cerebrovascular accidents, can also be called strokes. And so this is an interruption of the blood supply to a specific area of the brain. So if we have an interruption here, for example, where these arteries are blocked, we're going to end up with ischemia. And that means a lack of blood flow to this area that normally is supplied by that blood vessel. Within just a few minutes, those neurons and glia cells will start to die. So that's why it's so important to address a stroke or a cerebrovascular accident immediately. So the other reason that we need to know about the cerebrovascular system is that based on the symptoms that a patient has, after you know cerebrovascular anatomy and neuroanatomy, you can start to make educated guesses about where that blockage occurs. So for example, if we have a blockage, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll get back to that. This picture here shows blood vessels that were injected with plastic. This is from a brain of a 66-year-old man. And these blood vessels happen to be in the temporal pole, which is the most anterior region of the temporal lobe. So what I want you to take away from this is how dense this artery and vein vessel overall is in this area. And another thing I want you to take away from this is that the blood supply to the gray matter is even more dense than that of the white matter. And this makes sense on what you've already learned in this class. Gray matter contains cell bodies, as you know. Cell bodies are the metabolic centers for the cell. And so as those neurons become active, they are going to decrease oxygen and increase carbon dioxide in their immediate environment, and that blood's going to come in to help supply those neurons with new oxygen. In contrast to that, the white matter is composed of tracks. It doesn't need quite as much metabolic supply to carry out its functions. Now I'm going to go over some main points or an overview of the blood supply to the brain. And this is our first slide. So we need to talk about the blood-brain barrier. We've all heard about it, and this is a diagram that gives you a little bit of an idea of what it is. We're going to go into more detail later on in the semester, but you need to have this in your head just from the start. So the blood-brain barrier, here's the blood up here, here's the brain, and the extracellular brain tissue down here, and the fluid. So between the blood and the brain is this row of cells that are connected by these tight junctions. These cells are endothelial cells, and what the blood-brain barrier is just that. So things can't freely flow from the blood into the brain. Instead, they have to be actively transported by receptors or transporters through these cells in some cases to get to the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain. Some lipid-soluble agents can go through there. We'll get into that more later. But the point is that these cells, as well as the tight junctions, form a barrier, so we just can't get simple diffusion of things from the blood into the brain. So that's the blood-brain barrier. Another main overview concept that we need to be aware of is that of autoregulation. So in general, the overall blood flow to the brain stays constant. However, if we have an area of increased neuronal activity, that decreased oxygen in the area and that increased CO2 triggers the cerebrovascular system to dilate vessels and bring increased blood flow to that area that has increased neuronal activity. This is unique to the central nervous system, and is actually the basis for functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is what's shown here. So this bright spot here indicates increased blood flow, which indirectly shows the investigator or the medical personnel that that area of the brain is highly active. So that's autoregulation. Another concept that we need to be aware of is that of anastomoses. So there are anastomoses in the brain specifically. There's some other places as well, but the best known example is the cerebral arterial circle, which we're going to go into a lot more detail in the next two videos of this lecture. We have a collection of arteries up here and a collection of arteries down here, and they're connected by this right here, and this is an anastomoses. And the critical point or the critical function of an anastomoses is that it allows a possible route for blood to go around if we have a slowly developing blockage. So people who have high cholesterol, for example, are going to get a buildup of tissues in the vessels on parts of their brain. And if we have a buildup, for example, in this vessel that's slowly developing, normally the blood is going to come up and go this way, but it might be that this vessel can expand and allow the blood to come to those areas here. And so it would go from an anatomical anastomoses to a functional anastomoses. Unfortunately, if we have a rapidly developing clot, this is not going to help. But the anastomoses is basically allowing another route for the blood to flow. So that's actually the end of video 1. In the next video, we're going to start going into real specific anatomy about the cerebral arterial circle and the arteries